expansion of palm oil are getting bigger. At the same time, the territory of the indigenous communities are getting smaller.
Women can no longer get their fresh fish from the river due to the chemicals that are sprayed on these agricultural products. So, welcome to this seminar on human rights, designed to address the topic of land rights and what's the responsibility of investors. This is a seminar that forms part of a whole series of webinars and events around human rights. And my name is Beatrice Krona. I work at the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is an institute for transdisciplinary environmental research. And I'm also the executive director of a research program at the Royal Swedish Academy of Science, where one of our core themes is doing research that brings in Earth system dynamics into the financial risk and capital allocation discussion. Now, many of you will be familiar with the concept of planetary boundaries. This is a concept that emerged in around 2009, and it was developed by some of my colleagues, and it aims to make explicit that there are a number of key processes that determine how livable the planet will be for humans in the future. And shortly after this launch of this concept of planetary boundaries, others chimed in and noted that you cannot just consider the planetary scale boundaries. We also need to look at which are a ceiling, you could say, that we mustn't go over. But there are also limits that we mustn't go under when it comes to human needs, so like a social floor. And ultimately, this gave rise to what some have referred to as sort of a donut. And it even gave rise to Kate Raworth's donut economics. So human rights is obviously one of these fundamental social aspects that we must not violate as we pursue a socially and environmentally sustainable economy. And as we all know, money makes the world go round. So therefore, the role of investors in also contributing to steering our economy in this direction is essential. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We have four, hopefully. And in order of appearance, we have Radiatou Sherif Kamplai, who's the policy advisor at the Natural Resource Women's Platform in Liberia. Radiatou, can you wait?
Hi.
Next up, we have Yuyun Harmono, who's the campaign manager for climate justice at WALI in Indonesia. Yuyun.
Hello.
And we will also be joined shortly, we hope, by Nonette Royo, who's the executive director of the Tenure Facility. She's not with us at the moment, but she will come in later. And Karin Kronhaffer, who's the Director of Strategy and Communication at Swedfund, which is the Swedish Development Finance Corporation. Sorry, Karin.
No, sorry. Hi.
Okay, so with that, each of our speakers will be given approximately 5 minutes to elaborate on our particular questions of relevance to today's topic. And after this, I'm going to open the floor to the entire group to discuss the issues at hand. So I'm going to start off straight away by asking Radiatou to take the floor and speak to us on the topic of how are investments in large-scale commercial agriculture impacting communities in Liberia, particularly women, and particularly regarding their access to land and natural resources. So go ahead, Radiatou.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. This is Radiatou again from Liberia. So the question about how investments in large-scale commercial agriculture are impacting communities in Liberia. I can tell you that Liberia, for many years, has land, forests, and water resources that are used for communities. And then their land is actually used for farming and housing. And then the forests are like an immense resource on the members of the communities in which they are located. So they use both timber and non-timber forests from these forests. So the creeks, the rivers that they have, they actually are born and they use for water collection, washing, bathing, and fishing. And then the medicinal plants collected by women from the forest are used for treating varieties of ailments like typhoid, malaria, toothache, backache, diarrhea, dysentery, thrush, and then many, many more. So the arrival of the large-scale liposuction has left these women with nothing but horrible poverty, struggling daily to survive along with their families. Women in these areas of these large-scale liposuction for palm oil in particular, there are key areas where they have their operations for this palm oil company have been impacted. For example, looking at the working conditions, many women have developed serious backache as a result of the strenuous work involved in manually filling and transporting 80 polar bags of earth daily to the nursery sites. The reproductive and labor rights of women are being violated. Pregnant women have to ride those huge tractors or those trucks over long distances just to go to work. And any single day that is missed out, they wouldn't be paid for it. For example, in 2013, women told us that trucks were being used to transport them. And then they had this issue of health problems. The working hours, women have to leave their homes as early as 4 a.m. to start the journey to work because they have to make sure that they can be in time to get on that bus. For me, there's a powerful connection between the time women leave for work and the devastating impact on their school-going children who get up to prepare for schools without their mothers. How kids are prepared for school each day in these homes, this is something that leaves mothers with a difficult way to explain. So we also have this issue of an emerging issue of sexual gender-based issue that's coming out in these areas. I can tell you that, as you know, the companies are doing everything possible to make sure that they can suppress these women that are deciding to stand up to speak against the sexual gender-based issue. So they mobilize community leaders, and then they use these statements of condemnation against these reporting the sexual gender-based issue, including threat and intimidation. For example, recently we had a case where a lady stood up and spoke, and then she didn't call a name, but because this guy knew that he was seriously involved in this thing, you won't believe what he did. He walked to the court, he got a writ of arrest and arrested the lady and took her to court only because she spoke out against these things. Women are wrongfully dismissed every day. Workers are not provided safety gears. There are no access to medical services, maternity leave, and other employment benefits. When you think about access to food, women have lost land rights, leading to loss of farmland, loss of access to forest resources. They can no more collect firewoods. They can't get water. They can't collect mushroom. There's no way to collect medicinal plants only because the forest is clear. There's no forest for hunting anymore because the forest has been cleared. Women can no longer get their fresh fish from the river due to the chemicals that are sprayed on these agricultural products. Women only have access from farming on other nearby communities' land, which is very far away. They don't have access to medication. Women can no more collect medicinal plants because the forest has been cleared. Women employees and wives of men who work for the company do not have access to medical services. Maternity leave and other employment benefits are not available. There are no clinics. These are among many of the impacts that the concession company has created for women in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that detailed account of just how all of these concessions are impacting particularly women's lives. It's interesting, and we'll get back to some of these points in our joint discussion later on. But just as a follow-up, I wonder, could you tell us, are communities and particularly women then, are they participating at all, do you know, in consultations and decision-making regarding how these large-scale land concessions are being acquired and rolled out? And if so, how?
Well, I can tell you that this is for a fact that women have not participated in decision-making processes with the company. The only thing that has happened is that they only accept and agree to whatever the company says, because They are not consulted. They are not told about even the presence of the company. They only see the company and they only know that their male counterparts are the one that make the company. So you even hear women will say that, well, it is for us a male kind of company because for us women, we are not invited. We don't know what is happening. So it is clear to us in Liberia that women have not participated in decision-making processes as it relates to this large-scale land concession investment.
Okay, great. Thank you. So a point to pick up for us in the discussions later. Thank you, Radiatu. I'm now going to leave the floor to our next speaker, Yuyun Harmono from Wali in Indonesia. And you were going to tell us something about how the expansion of oil palm and the oil palm sector in Indonesia has affected local communities, indigenous peoples, and the forest and the farmland. Please, Yuyun, go ahead.
Thank you for this great opportunity. My name is Yuyun. I'm from Indonesia. I work in Walhi as Climate Justice Campaign Manager. Palm oil, it's still until now one of the main problems for the destruction of the forest and as well as the violation of the human right, especially the indigenous right. Since 80s and 90s, the expansion of palm oil are getting bigger. At the same time, the territory or the home of the indigenous communities as well as the forest-dependent communities are getting smaller. And that's created tension, especially related to the tenure conflict between the indigenous community and the companies. But this is facilitated by the government because the governments are the ones who's giving a permit to the companies at the beginning. But at the same time, until now, the recognition of the indigenous community land rights, it's not being acknowledged yet by the governments. Some small improvement happened. In 2012, the indigenous communities are go to the court, to the constitutional court, to challenge the acknowledgement of the indigenous communities' land rights, and they won. But then it's not being followed up by the governments. Especially, there is no law in Indonesia that guarantee the indigenous communities' right. Until now, we still fight that in the parliament, but it didn't pass yet. The second problem is related with the pollution, whether it's related with the pollution of water as well as the pollution of air, because the fruit branch, especially the waste from fruit branch, it's highly polluted, and it's polluting the environment, not only water but also the surrounding environment, and that's create another problem and related with the health. The heavy, they use a lot of chemical in the process, and that's created also a problem related to health. In terms of the right of indigenous communities during this COVID pandemic, we've seen a lot of human rights violation happening during the pandemic. So this pandemic did not stop the companies to do what they usually do. They just do business as usual, and it's created a lot of problem with the indigenous community, especially in some part of the Indonesia, in Kalimantan, but as well as in other part of Indonesia. So palm oil, for the governments and the companies, they see that as improvement in economic, but for the indigenous community and the forest dependent community, that means destruction for their home. Forest is related directly with the way of life. It is source of food for the indigenous community and forest dependent community, and it's now being destroyed because of the expansion of palm oil.
Oh, thank you so much. Let me follow up also just with a short question for you. You spoke about the the difficulty we're seeing now because of the situation where, if I understand it correctly, the community land rights are not recognized by the Indonesian government fully. And at the same time, it's the government who are providing the concessions to big corporates, and investors are investing in these companies. So what I would like to ask you is, what do you see as the most pressing regulatory needs? What is it that the government needs to change in terms of regulation, and in order for investors also to be able to have some leverage to address these questions?
I think the law that acknowledge the indigenous communities' right need to be there. That will be guarantee the right of indigenous community for their livelihood as well as for their land, their territory. The second one would be to stop the expansion of palm oil. And this is require also the responsibility from the buyers, from the consumption side. So it should be also reducing the consumption of this community. So it should be work both ways, stopping the expansion as well as the reduction for the consumption. And more importantly is that we need a law that acknowledge the indigenous community right as well as their land.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll be coming back to these issues again as well when we return in the bigger discussion. But thank you for now, Yuyun. Thanks for joining us, Nonette. I'm going to ask you to now give us a 5-minute reflection on why is secure tenure an important achievement for Indigenous people and local communities, and what role could secure land rights play to buffer against exploitation? Please, Nonette, go ahead.
Yes, the first part is why it's really important. The tenure, I'm Nonette Royo, and I speak on behalf of the tenure facility and the experiences of the partners, Indigenous peoples and local communities that we support. And every one of our partners are positioned in the territories that are either in natural forests or in forest landscapes that are in transition towards being converted, or are in already in rural areas surrounding or in the fringes of forests. What we found out that's really important is that there is a kind of document that proves that the Indigenous peoples and local communities in the land are the ones that have been in the land for a long time, and that they are taking care of the land and would be positioned to make decisions on what to do with that land. So that forms in general what we call tenure. And the instruments that are required for that is really important for this conversation to happen between the communities that are occupying the land and the people that are wanting to come into the land, either to use the land or explore or exploit that land. So the importance of having that be formalized with a clear instrument of recognition has become the focus of what the tenure facility has done and is doing with the partners. And the experience is that has changed so much the behavior of the external parties that are coming into the land and looking at what they can take or use or negotiate with the people occupying that land. And the laws, policies, regulations, judicial decisions that support that is one important pillar of what is the reason why we do this work. So, and it is important that that becomes the tool to support and protect the communities and to help them negotiate reasonably to the authorities. So there are other, these instruments are legal and or policy-based. and or based on court decisions. So I would encourage us to look at this more as not a black and white, you have to have the law first before the rights are recognized. The practice and what we're learning from our partnerships is that there is formal and there is customary. And within the formal, there is the law, there's the policy, and there's the practice and the agreements, and there's judicial decisions. All of those offer instruments that the communities can hold to negotiate their position. So with especially for the private sector, what is significant in our learning is that with the licenses that they get from government and the negotiations that they do with local governments, there are spaces by which the indigenous communities and the local communities, indigenous peoples and local communities that have become partners, were able to take up those spaces, use local regulation, use the judicial decision, and use the existing processes leading to recording and registration that already enabled them to come to the table and assert or make those decisions and defend themselves in court. These processes, especially for now, had become very instrumental in ensuring that the governments listen, and in fact giving the government some kind of way, because the government is at different levels. It's not really homogeneous. Different ministries have different processes and procedures. So this enables and ensures that what the path that is taken by partners is actually the path that is supported by law and policy, not just nationally, but also regionally and internationally.
Thank you. Now, if I summarize briefly, these instruments, what is needed are these instruments for demonstrating tenure somehow, and the processes by which that can be achieved. You also highlighted some of them, noting that not all of them have to be legal from the start, because if we wait for the law, we will be waiting for a long time. So starting to establish practice is important. Can you just give us do you have a specific example that you can give where this has been done or pursued by a community and where it was successful, just to kind of spell it out for those of us who are not as familiar with this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We can probably, there are different countries that have already done this, and before I cite an example, I would just like to state that different countries have different procedures, but generally it's the constitution and then the law, and then there are certain policies and or judicial decisions. If there's not a law, there's a judicial decision, and then there are regulations. So let's tackle, for example, the procedures. Like I've just followed the Indonesia example. It's been described earlier. The judicial decision was the MK 35. So the Constitutional Court decision number 35, and that has stated, the Constitutional Court has stated in Indonesia that where there are indigenous peoples in the forests, the land where that forest belongs is that of the indigenous peoples. So that alone is a judicial decision, has been at the basis for many of the regulations that came out. And so this gave birth to different tenure instruments. And this range of tenure instruments are now being implemented very slow, incrementally, by the Ministry of Forestry. And they are implementing regulations for that. So that's one track for our partnerships in Indonesia, especially with the Alliance for Indigenous Peoples, the registration units of BRWA, and the Agrarian Reform Consortium are using. So that's one example, the Constitutional Court decision. the policy on land for agrarian reform, and then the policy on one map. That these are ways by which the partners have then taken and used for implementation to measure the different boundaries of territories of indigenous peoples and local communities, and then put the data into the system. And the system requires time for verification and recognition. Meanwhile, the communities that have the maps can already position themselves in village regulations, village regulation planning, land use planning, and negotiations. So there are different levels, and it is true what has been stated about the difficulties, especially when government provides licenses, but it enables the negotiations to happen.
Great, thank you. That was very, I think that's very insightful, and it can help us take it the next step in discussing this. But first we have our fourth and final speaker, Karin Kronhofer from the Swedfund, which is the Swedish Development Finance Corporation. And Karin, you noted to me earlier that you are not an expert in land use necessarily, or even in large-scale agriculture, but you have a long experience with development finance, and you have an experience with human rights. So can you tell us instead a little bit about, from a general perspective, how you and Swedfund look at the responsibility that investors have for their investments in companies that risk violating human rights, regardless of the sector?
Yes, thank you. So I would like to highlight three aspects that I believe is of importance when you are a development finance institution and you have a mission that is that you should increase the positive impact on society by the sustainable investments that you make. And I believe that it is important to look at the mission of the investor and the goals of the investor. It is important to look at the business model, how you are operationalized, how you would like to deliver on your mission, and also to look at the partners with whom you cooperate. So if you look at Swedfund, who is the Swedish Development Finance Institution, our mission is to fight poverty by sustainable investments. And our owners, they have made it very clear to us that we do have a responsibility when it comes to human rights and to implement the United Nations guiding principles on businesses and human rights. If you look at our owner directive, it says that we should increase the financial empowerment of women, that we should work with the decent job aspect, minimizing negative impact on the climate, that we should strive to mobilize private capital, and that we should look at the financial viability of the companies where we invest. So we have the same goal as Swedish Development Corporation, but the tools that we possess are different. We're using the equity instrument, the loan instrument, and the fund instrument to reach more and to share risk. If you look at the business model and how we have tried to work and take our responsibility as a responsible investor and as a DFI, it rests on three pillars: on impact on society, sustainability, and financial viability. And all these three pillars are of equal importance for us when we decide to go into an investment. And we use these pillars when we do the analysis before we decide to invest, during the value creation phase, and also when exiting, trying to measure progress and see whether we have been able to contribute to movement of the portfolio company in a more sustainable direction. I would like to say a few words on the work that we do with regard to human rights, which is part of the sustainability pillar in our business model. So we have introduced a human rights lens to our investment process. That means that as a first step, when we are considering to make an investment, we make a human rights analysis. That analysis is on country level, on local level, and on sector level. If we decide to take the investment to step 2, we make a more thorough analysis of the contextual environment and the contextual risks of that particular investment. We're looking at the environmental risks, social risks and also the human rights risks. And in that analysis, we are looking for triggers which might cause the risk for human rights violations. We're talking to the local community, we're talking to the portfolio company, and based on the picture and the analysis that we're making, we're developing a plan for not only first we identify the risks and then a plan for how to mitigate the risks that we have identified. The next phase of the investment process is that we should have to work with the value creation phase. How can we ensure that we are achieving the results that we would like to see and that we are actually succeeding in mitigating human rights risk? And that is when we have to follow up together with portfolio companies. We can do it by visiting, we can do it by asking questions to the portfolio company on the progress that they are making in this particular area. And then we have the exit phase where we should estimate the human rights impact that the investment has had, but also the environmental impact. So I think you need both the mission, you need a business model, but then you need a partner. And here we have worked closely together with civil society, both when it comes to developing our human rights lens process, but also on other issues such as women's financial empowerment. And we're constantly developing our business model and our analysis to better understand and to make sure that we are aware of the risks that we are facing. We have a cooperation with the Kvinna till Kvinna, a Swedish NGO. They are helping us to better understand the risks of gender-based violence in an investment and also to develop a toolbox for our portfolio companies to use to help them to minimize the risk for that. We have worked together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and they have, together with some of our fund investments, developed a toolbox for how the funds can work with the implementation of the United Nations guiding principles. And then I think partnership also with the other co-investors, we're always a minority investor, to ensure that they share our agenda and that they are looking for the same kind of progress that we would like to see. And also, of course, the portfolio company, our local partner, that they are willing to the changes that we would like to see. I think I stop there.
Thank you. So it's interesting to hear you talk from a kind of general perspective. One thing that strikes me is you speak about what Swedfund does, and I interpret that as a sort of, the format of your due diligence to not incur harm. And you talk about these triggers. I'm wondering, could you exemplify what triggers might be, and perhaps link this to the notion of metrics, or what is it specifically that one would want to monitor, that you monitor, shall we say, in what you perceive are risky environments where human rights violations are likely or possible?
Yes, I think it really depends on the context we're in, and it depends on what kind of sector and what kind of community-based triggers that we might identify. So it might differ, but I think that one important aspect that we are carefully looking into is when it comes to the decent work aspect of the human rights area of human rights, and that is, of course, to look at the likelihood, or is there anything in the working environment that might trigger a particular project from our side to try and ensure that the jobs that the portfolio company is offering are also decent. And that might have to do with the health and safety in the workplace. It might have to do with the gender aspect. Are we ensuring that the women working in that company, they are listened to, and that they get the opportunity to contribute in a good way to the success of the company? There are several very different factors. There might be triggers that is connected more to the social and cultural setting of the investment, or it might be triggers that are connected to the sector. If we're making an investment in the health sector, for example, there are certain issues that we need to consider more in depth. And we might also, if the investment is triggering on many of these indicators, then we have to make a more thorough analysis. We have to take this one step further to really create an in-depth understanding for us whether these are risks that are possible to actually mitigate. So part of the role that we have to be additional is that we should not go into environments, context, companies that are already mature from a sustainability or human rights perspective. We should go in and contribute to change and to movement. And I think this is extremely important because investments that the DFIs or that Swedfund is doing, we would like to contribute to the creation of more decent jobs, that we ensure that there are essential products and services offered to the local community if it comes to renewable energy or health or so on. But then we have to work to ensure that we do this responsibly.
Thank you. Great. I think actually listening to you speak now and reflecting back on what was said earlier in today's seminar by Radiatu, for example, to me, it rings, I hear a lot of similarities of what you're talking about, you know, the decent, or not similarities, but overlapping what you've said. We heard her speak about the undecent work environment of a lot of the women in Liberia. And I'm just wondering at this point, I'd like to also invite the other speakers. So starting perhaps first with Radiatu and Yuyun to comment on what you've heard from from Karin, for example.
Hi.
Yes, please go ahead, Radiatu.
Yeah, so what Colin says so good, but you know, most of the time is what is written on the book, what should be, but in reality, things that are on the ground in terms of how these conditions are quite different from what is written down. But the reality is that when these communities are visited and they are spoken to, these are the things you hear from them. These are the things you see that these women go through. It is a day-to-day activities for them. And the reason why they are going through these struggles is because like they have no other alternative. Their lands have been taken away. They can farm no more. They can no more go to the forest to collect anything. So as a result, they are like forced to work for the company. And when they decide to work for the company, these are the conditions they are in. They are suffering. It's all over. All of the agricultural companies we have around here is the same, ranging from the Golden Petroleum, some Dhabi, the Equatorial Palm Oil when you visit all of those areas. Because like the study we did back in 2000, between 2014 up to 2016, it's clear to us that all of the companies, all of the working conditions of these people are the same. It's just that there are differences in terms of each one of the company and how these companies carry out the way they do theirs. But like there are challenges, the challenges are the same. So what investors need to do is to be able to make sure that what they've put in on the book in terms of how these operations will not affect women or even those others, they should make sure that they can be able to invest in investment that will not violate human rights, but making sure that they monitor what happens on the ground, because that is what is lacking. They should not take advantage because, for example, there are weak legal regimes or areas where the investment may feel that the laws are very weak. They could go in and try to enforce or implement these existing provisions, because there are some countries like Liberia, we have these issues. We have a very good legal system, but the regime is kind of weak. How laws are implemented, we have some challenges in those areas. Investments should actually try to make sure that they will try to avoid divide and rule tactics, because these are some of the things we see in this area. So the NGOs moving, try to help the communities, they group the communities so that they can stand up to fight for their rights. But the companies in turn will try to make sure that they can play divide and rule tactics as a way of breaking the community resilience against their investment. And there are human rights policies like you talk about. They take actions So these human rights policies that are written, they shouldn't be written just on the book, but action should be taken when violation of human rights occur. They should be able to make sure that they can prevent any form of adverse human rights impact that are directly linked to their operations, their products, those services, their businesses, the relationship. If any one of them will contribute, then there's a need to make sure that they can try to have that impact not being seen or reduced or completely.
Thank you. What about you, Jung? Would you like to comment on anything that Nonette or Karin said? Because I'm thinking actually there was a direct connection to the Indonesian case here earlier.
Yeah, I have several comments. One would be related with the investment and the responsibility of the investor, and the second one is on how we can deal with the problem. For example, in Indonesia, where we don't have any law that recognize the indigenous community, but at the same time, we also need to secure what remaining from the expansion of the recent companies, for example. For the investor, I think there is one question that need to be answered. The first one would be, what is the responsibility of the investor if the violation of human rights, the harm is already done, and at the same time the investor is not investing in that company anymore? So how can the communities can get their justice, their right? The second question would be, all of these human rights guiding principle is voluntary, and we haven't have yet now the mandatory regulation. It can be mandatory if it's if it's already issued laws in particular country that related with the guiding principle. Yeah, but in international level, we haven't yet got any kind of instrument. That is why WALHI, as part of the Friends of the Earth International Federation, we propose for more legally binding instrument to regulate this corporation, not only in their countries, but also beyond their countries, transnational. It's moved very slow, but at the same time, it's also getting resistance from not all European countries, but I think European Union itself, it didn't really support this cause. It's mainly come up from the developing countries. They're strongly supporting this kind of thing, because they, as governments as well, they already experiencing the problem related with the responsibility of transnational corporation as well. In Indonesia, of course, there is an improvement. Yeah, the indigenous community, the indigenous organization, they win in the constitutional court, and that lead to the other instrument for the recognition of the indigenous communities' land rights. But at the same time, the governments are now reluctant, to give back the land that supposed to be owned by the indigenous community and forest dependent, because they're now facilitating more investment in the sense of in the sense of growth, especially during pandemic, because the economy is slowing down, and then they want to raise the investment by facilitating more investment and reducing the protection for the environment, as well as rights, human rights. It can be labor's right, it can be indigenous community rights, it can be the right to healthy environment, that supposed to be as a as a protection for the for the expansion of the companies, as well as the investor as well. So I think that's the main problem. In several years, we identified that the government is not really want to give back the land to the indigenous community, but it's more facilitating the recent policies right now is more facilitating the investor.
Thank you. So I don't know, I don't see Nonette on the screen here, but I'd like to ask Nonette if you have something that you would like to also chip in. Otherwise, what I noted here, so I will give the word to you, but otherwise, what I noted are also two topics that I think directly speak sort of to the investor perspective. So, but Nonette, why don't you chime in first, and then we can discuss what this means for investors.
Yeah, just quickly, there are assumptions here that when we come in and support land rights and rights of peoples, that there will be laws and there will be procedures to respond to those rights. But the rights, the demanding and the asking and the execution of those rights are already protected by the Constitution. And it's really good that there are laws that are being proposed and asked for, but the citizens have these rights and they can exercise this customarily or formally in ways that they can demand and that they can use the systems. So the 10-year instruments that are there, especially for negotiations with private sector, is something that they can use. And even without it, the positioning with a map already is useful to be able to talk to these companies. The duty bearers, the government and the companies, are bound by the standards that they have signed up to, but it is not automatic, as we have experienced, that those become immediately given just because the law or the standard is there. It will never happen that way. So the power of those that are directly affected will have to be built, and they are being built, and they are being exercised, and they are being recorded, and they're being told as stories. These are very important elements that are not dependent on when the laws come. The laws will be there, and we had perfect laws in the Philippines, and the execution is still very difficult. So it is not, the solution is not just the law, or the solution is not just the standard. Even if, yes, they are very important to work on, it is really the power of the people that are asking and their decisions, not represented by anyone, but they can pick the representatives they want and they trust, and they can use these processes in these conversations. There will have to be conversations. There will have to be negotiations, because citizens are citizens and they choose to become those citizens in the countries that they belong. Then they will have to have these conversations and negotiations and lawmaking and court procedures. But it will not stop at any point just because we're waiting for something. It is not going to happen that way.
Thank you. So trying to listen to the different things that have been said and bringing it together, I feel like what I heard is that there are still, and I'm sure we can all subscribe to that in different domains, discrepancies between what companies report and the conditions on the ground. I mean, this is, I think, is a tricky problem. It's a recognized problem in whether you're talking about social or environmental issues. And at the same time, picking up on what Nonette just said is that, laws they're not the only way to achieve progress here. And so I guess I'm posing the question to all of you, but first the word to Karin. What do you think when it comes to what investors can do, that investors are in fact demanding something of companies or can demand something of companies? What can investors do to push companies to improve reporting and to, in that way, actually, not bypass, but while we're waiting for laws, also push how companies and investors engage directly with the communities to ensure that we are seeing an improvement in human rights, but also in other things?
Yes, thank you. No, I think that it's never either or, it's both. And you need to have the policies. You have to have complaint mechanism allowing for all the stakeholders, the local communities, etc., to whistleblow in case they see that mistakes are done or the development is not good from a human rights perspective or other perspectives. So I think it is important with the structure if you're going to do a responsible investment. I also believe that it's extremely important to follow up during the value creation phase. And I think that what we do when we are doing the analysis, we're formulating, right? We are starting by identifying the gaps that we see. And we identify those gaps in dialogue with local stakeholders and others. And we are developing a plan, an environmental, social, and governance plan, which also includes the human rights aspects, together with the portfolio company before we decide to invest. When we decide to invest, we make that plan legally binding in the sense that it's part of the contract, which allows us to follow up and also to report to the Swedish public and to others on the results that we have achieved. And when we report the impact that we've had on society, we report the impact on sustainability, and we report the financial viability. And the results are audited with the same level of authority by our auditors. So I think it is important to follow up and also to report and be transparent, both about the achievements that you've made, but also the challenges that you are facing. And I think that this is an excellent example also of which when I listen to all of you, if we take the issue of gender or economic empowerment of women, we also have the opportunity to work with what we call technical assistance. And we have one program called Women for Growth, where we're actually visiting the portfolio companies and we're talking to the women, and the women helps us to they themselves can identify what kind of changes they would like to see in their workplace. And they can identify actions that they would like the company leadership to take or us as investors to take, and then we can work together in achieving change. So the technical assistance component in the countries where we are extremely important. I also agree with the analysis on how the pandemic has worsened the contextual environment in which we operate and others live and operate in. And I think that there are our portfolio company or our investment is not working in isolation from other parts of society or influence of the pandemic or other dark forces that do, of course, also increase the contextual risks for us.
Yeah, thank you. And so can I just follow up with the question then? And this is again for you, Karin, because the whole seminar is about what sort of the role of investments. But I'm happy for anyone else to raise your hand and chip in as well. But I hear you speak about these practices that you are developing and the technical assistance, and sounds like exactly the way to sort of get these communication with the on the ground stakeholders to a much higher degree. But I also recognize that Swedfund is a peculiar investor in that you are an explicitly socially responsible investor, and that is your role. Of course, many of the companies that are out there operating, and some of which we've heard alluded to here in Liberia and Indonesia, are not companies or that have investors that are necessarily socially responsible as their sole mission. And so I'm just curious if you could say something about how do development finance corporations like Swedfund collect these practices and try to transmit them so that they become more mainstream for investors that are investing in the companies that we're seeing problems with in the noted regions, for example.
I think that we can do much more in that sense, in sharing the experience that we have and how we have worked to mitigate the negative consequences of the investments we make. We do talk to other private investors, but I think that we can do even more in assisting them. And I also think that it's not only us. I also think that civil society have a very strong voice in helping them to develop their way of operating and their way of analyzing various risks, and not only analyzing, having the processes in place, but then to follow up on the ground and to report on what you see when you visit the investee company. So I think there is much more we can do in that sense.
Okay. I have one final one, which I do think might trigger some reaction. It was actually raised by Yun, I think, but it's a really interesting one. And I think it relates to the role of the investor for violations, in this case of human rights violations, but it could be environmental violations as well. In the past, I mean, we think of investors, we think of responsible investors as board engagement, trying to push the companies to do better. But there comes a time, and we see this time and time again, companies just simply resist. What do you do? Well, there's an exit strategy. You can divest, right? Or you can, but what happens then? What happens if the violations have already been done? As you pointed out, the damage is done. What can we do to improve the situation so that we're not left, because it becomes a sort of conundrum of a never ending, you'll always have another investor coming in perhaps and filling that space, but yet the harm is done and the accountability is lost. Any and all comments on this particular tricky topic?
Well,
go ahead, Carl.
No, I think that is also the issue of compensation, or how you are held accountable as an investor or as the portfolio company. I think that is regulated in the United Nations Guiding Principles on Businesses and Human Rights. What we have learned is that it's important to make the due diligence before you enter into an investment, that you have like a human rights baseline, how the situation is in that particular area when you enter. And that also helps you to, when you decide to exit as an investor, to see whether you have contributed badly or in a good way compared to the baseline when you entered as an investor. And then I think the way that you should, or that you consider to compensate, is also regulated by the principles, and depends on the role that you've had in the investment, what kind of instrument you have used, the harm that you might have caused, etc. So, yeah.
Well, I'll ask the panel again if there's any final comments you would like to make. If not, I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I'm not sure we've reached any final solutions, but I think the improved monitoring and on-the-ground connection between what's reported and the on-the-ground due diligence process and also monitoring process by investors certainly seems like it's key, it's fundamental, and it's something where probably development corporations can do more to spread the word of your practices to the wider investment community. But please, anyone?
Yeah, so I would like to say that investors should ensure that they conduct human rights due diligence with emphasis on conflict and gender-sensitive human rights due diligence. The impact of these concessions on women, on children, is very challenging in some of these communities where we've worked. So if investors can try as much as possible and conduct these human rights due diligence and highlighting conflict areas and gender sensitivity, I think these are areas where the issues of human rights, abuse and violations and others can be curtailed. This is key because for some of the communities, they have to travel distances to be able to find food, to fetch safe drinking water, because their waters are polluted, to be able to collect firewood, they got to go to fireplaces to be able to heat their homes and cook, and to be able to collect medicinal plants. So these issues are looked into. There will be a change where these will not be things that will be a problem for these communities where these investments are being operated. So I would like to clearly say that I recommend that those that these companies can make sure that when they are to be able to identify gaps, that all the way identify those gaps, they could reach out to these communities themselves. It doesn't have to be maybe through the companies, because at times the companies will present a different narrative, unlike reality on ground. So they have to try their best in a way that they themselves can visit these communities so that they can see for themselves the kind of issues and challenges these people have on the ground, and then they can be able to find out a way that they could easily solve these problems. Because I can tell you that women livelihood comes from this farming, the fishing, and collection of these forest products. And I can ensure you that because the land and the forest is a huge blessing to these women, almost everything that they consume comes from these areas. So the presence of the forest actually ensures that women have essential part in their culture is actually preserved. So when these investments come and they destroy the forest and they grab the land without the consent of these women, their livelihood has been destroyed. So I'm recommending that all palm companies respect women's tenure rights in and around large-scale construction as is required by law, but that also that women can go back to enjoy these rights that they've had decades ago in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Radiata. I think that was a really powerful finish. And I think, to me, it also really emphasizes, and this is a way, I guess, to speak to investors. Many investors are now looking to map their investors, the impact of their investments on the SDGs. And I think, to paraphrase or summarize what you just said, I think by recognizing and respecting women's tenure rights, you actually increase your own capacity to also deliver, or at least not harm, produce negative impacts on a number of other SDGs, such as, no hunger, education, and whatnot. And I think it's so important that we recognize the interconnection between what's being done and how that links to other SDGs. I think it's hard, but not enough attention is being put to it as we start to map investment impact on SDGs. So I think with that, I think it's time to conclude today's seminar, and I'd like to thank the panel and our speakers, all of you, for really insightful comments and for really unpacking the issue and helping us to understand what needs to be done. So thank you very much.